Well, hello. This is the lecture for Friday, August 27th, 2020. It's going to deal with the wars fought between the Greek city-states and Persia, as well as several of the Athenian leaders. To understand Greek history, one has to simply look at Athens and Sparta. Now, Sparta was a landlocked area right down here, and Athens was on the sea, the Aegean Sea, right over here. Sparta was a city that was based around its military. All boys were placed in schools, and in these schools they learned the art of combat and how to be part of the military unit. They would live in the barracks of these schools until they were 30. At that time, they were put in what I guess we would today call the National Guard. In time of war, Spartan warriors were some of the fiercest of any of the Greek city-states. Athens, on the other hand, was a city that was built around culture. People in Athens were extremely proud of their artisans, their poets, and their scholars. This is not to say that Athens did not have great warriors. The Athenian navy was considered the greatest navy in the world. Here is a video that deals with a comparison of Sparta and Athens.
Compare Athens versus Sparta, two Greek city-states. We start with location. Athens was near the sea and their military was a navy, while Sparta was inland and their military was an army. Each city-state had a different local god. For Athens, it was Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, and for Sparta, it was Ares, the god of war. For jobs, in Athens, there were a lot of artisans, poets, and philosophers, while in Sparta, people were mainly warriors, although there were also some artisans. The economy of Athens centered around trade since they were so close to the sea. They had a marketplace called an agora, and they traded with convenient coins. However, Sparta relied on farming and conquering others. Their money was iron bars, which was pretty inconvenient. For government, Athens had a democracy and citizens voted for laws. In Sparta, there was an oligarchy, which was led by a few people known as the Council of Elders. In Athens, women had few rights. They had no say in government, and they mostly managed the home and raised children. In Sparta, though, women had many rights. They could even own lands, have jobs, and they were expected to be strong to defend their land. Slaves in Athens were treated better than they were in Sparta, and some even had some job skill training. In Sparta, slaves had some rights, but for the most part, they were treated very poorly and harshly since they were prisoners of war. The purpose of education in Athens was to create good citizens, and only boys were educated. Military training started at age 18, while in Sparta, it started at age 7, and education was for both boys and girls with the intention of making them strong, brave warriors. In summary, Athens was a more peaceful city-state with lots of trade and democracy. On the other hand, Sparta was all about conquering its enemies, and they had an oligarchy and a strong army.
Okay, let's take a look at this to make sure that we have these down in our notes. Now, the government of Athens was a democracy. That's where everyone gets to vote. The government of Sparta is an oligarchy. This is when a few key individuals run the show. In Athens, the economy was based on trade with other city-states, with other countries. Sparta was mostly farming. In Athens, slaves had some rights. In Sparta, slaves had very few rights. In Athens, it was male-dominated. Only males could be part of the polis, could vote. In Sparta, women were given more rights, although they could not vote. The education in Sparta was one of, let's become better artisans, let's become better scholars. In Sparta, the education was all about joining the army, and both men and women in Sparta were given the right. Athens was on the sea, Sparta was inland. The Athenian navy was second to none. The Athenian army was second to none. Now you understand what I'm getting ready to do. I'm getting ready to create an essay question where I ask you to compare at least 3 things that differed from Athens and Sparta. So again, I think this is something that we need to get down in our notes. In Athens, laws were created so the citizens knew where they stood. These next couple of slides are going to talk about the leader of Athens. Around the 400s BC, Athens was led by a leader by the name of Draco. Now, Draco's big beef was he wanted to make sure that the laws applied to everyone fairly. So he wrote all the laws down. Now, most of the punishment for breaking the laws was death or some type of dismemberment. And so a lot of times people would call the draconian codes, they would call them something that was very harsh. If you are a newspaper reader, you know that this week the Missouri House has been in session, and the governor had called upon the House to make individuals who are between the ages of 14 and 18 adults in certain crimes. Many of the Democrats who voted against this said that that law was quite draconian. After Draco comes Solon. Now, Solon believed that Solon believed in more political freedoms, more political reforms. In time, the wealthy will join with Solon and they will kick Draco out as the leader. Now, one of the reforms that Solon talked about was he wanted more people to be able to vote. Now, to be part of the polis, you had to own property. Under Draco, you had to own a lot of property. Under Solon, you only had to own a small amount. Solon also believed that if you were a businessman and you paid your taxes, you should be able to vote as well. Solon was replaced by Pisistratus. Now, Pisistratus believed in land reform. There were those who had borrowed money to buy land, and it seemed like every time they had paid off the land, the people who had loaned them money suddenly came up and said, "Oh, you owe some more." And so Pisistratus decided that he would absolve some of these people who had paid for long periods of time and say, your debts have been paid for. Now, of course, for people who had loaned out the money, they weren't too crazy about this, but more people enjoyed what Pisistratus was saying, and they felt that he was a good leader. The last leader we're going to worry about was Cleanastices. Now, Cleanastices believed that leaders could be removed for doing something foolish, for doing something, although not criminal, made Athens look bad. And so Cleinias suggested that those who were part of the polis meet in the agora, that's the marketplace, one day out of the year. And on that day, if they wanted to vote somebody out, they could ostracize that individual. Now, I believe ostracized is one of the terms that is on our term sheet. Here at Helias, you have your group of friends. Let's say that you become interested in a person that your group of friends does not much care for. if you continue to see them, they say they will not be your friends anymore. This is a way that we could say you have been ostracized. In 490 BC, that would be in the 5th century BC, the Greek city-states were threatened by Persia. Now, Persia is the combination of two modern-day countries, Iraq and Iran. Persia was led by Darius, and Darius believed the way to defeat the Greek city-states was to go across the Aegean Sea by water. He wants to land at a place called Marathon. Now, at Marathon, the various city-states will be there to meet him, and although outnumbered, they will be successful in driving him back into the sea. Now, Philippides was a runner, and Philippides will run from Marathon to Sparta to let the Spartans know that they are under attack and ask the Spartans for help. Hearing the Spartans say no, Philippides will now run to Athens and call for more men. He will then run to Sparta. He will then run to Marathon. He will hear of the great victory, and he will run from Marathon to Athens to announce the great victory, and then he promptly dies. Now, the distance from Marathon to Athens has been called, in a race terms, the marathon. And when the modern Olympics were held in 1896, the last race of the Olympics was the marathon. Traditionally, the men's marathon is either the last race or the next to last race. Here's a look at the battle against Darius.
To defend their state from invasion and destruction. The world's first democracy would now be tested in the crucible of war and conflict. BC, 18 years after the founding of democracy. A lone figure runs across the mountainous terrain of Greece. His name is Phidippides, and he is a citizen of Athens. On this day, Phidippides will make one of the most astonishing athletic achievements in history. The inspiration for our modern marathon. But Phidippides' quest is not for glory, but survival. His homeland is about to be conquered by the mighty Persian Empire. In the early 5th century BC, the Persians were the greatest power on the world stage. Their vast empire stretched from India in the east to Turkey in the west. Now, out on their western frontier, the tiny state of democratic Athens was gaining power. This was a threat that the Persians would have to destroy. The Persians lived in a culture of unbending tyranny. At the head of their empire sat Darius, known to the Greeks only as the Great King. Suppliants had to cover their mouths in his presence, just to avoid tainting the air he breathed. For Phidippides and the democratic Athenians, conquest by Darius and the Persians would mean the destruction of their entire way of life.
There is a huge cultural difference between the Greeks and the Persians. The Greeks are a people who emphasize freedom. The Persians would put far more emphasis on obedience. It's a struggle between freedom and slavery.
The Persian force landed at a sandy bay called Marathon. just 26 miles from Athens. News of the invasion spread through the streets like wildfire. This was a city without a standing army. Every male citizen would have to come to the defense of his state. The poorer citizens have spears, sticks, bows and arrows, whatever weapons they can find. But the heart of the Athenian force would be the hoplites, men who could afford heavy bronze armor, a shield, a spear, a sword. The Athenians would field a small but determined force.
That's probably the first time in the history of the Athenian state that the entire population had been mustered. And for them to field 10,000 hoplites out of a citizenry that might have only been 20 or 30,000, it's a level of involvement that's astounding.
But as they faced the Persians on the battlefield, the Athenians held out little hope of victory. They were outnumbered by 2 to 1. Pheidippides' desperate mission was to run for help from one of Athens' local rivals, the Greek state of Sparta. Even as he ran, Pheidippides must have imagined the horror that his fellow Athenians now faced.
You're dodging spears from your men in front and your men in behind. You probably couldn't see or hear. All you would feel would be pressure. You wouldn't see the sword plunge that took one of your testicles off. You would not see the spear thrust that took your head off. You would have no idea what was going on, just the momentum that carried you ahead. All you would be aware of is that you had to push forward and keep stabbing and keep on your feet, and you would hope that everybody else would do that.
Pheidippides' run was to become the stuff of legend. Fired by the terror that his fellow citizens were being slaughtered, he ran 140 miles in just 2 days. But Pheidippides' quest would end in failure. Help would be refused. He was left only with the knowledge that his fellow Athenians would have to fight alone. Pheidippides could never have imagined that the Greeks would in fact win a glorious victory. The Athenians had rushed at their foe in a headlong charge, and the Persians had scattered in the face of their assault. The Athenians slaughtered over 6,000 Persians in one fateful day. The world's first democracy had survived its first great test.
Every Athenian knew that he had voted to fight and that this reflected the majority vote of the citizens, and that was not true of the Persian. Whatever you want to say about democracy, it fields the most patriotic, enthusiastic, and often large armies.
The Athenians returned to their city to celebrate their victory. Amongst them was one for whom the war with Persia had only just begun. An Athenian general named Themistocles. Themistocles had fought on the battlefield at Marathon. He was typical of a new generation of Athenian leaders, a man who had risen to power through democracy.
Themistocles is a fascinating character, very much an example of the effect of democracy in Athens. It's relatively clear that he doesn't come from the inner circle of the landed aristocracy that traditionally had ruled in Athens.
There were stories told about his feeling rather touchy about the fact that he hadn't had a traditional aristocratic upbringing, for example, in music and poetry. In fact, that might have given him a spur to show that he could do as well as someone who had gone to all the right schools, as it were.
Themistocles' opinion of his common origins was blunt and straightforward.
I may not know how to play the lyre or flute, but I do know how to make a city great.
Themistocles had learnt the skills of leadership here, the Democratic Assembly of Athens. From this very podium, Themistocles would now show himself to be one of history's greatest leaders, the savior of his city. For Themistocles alone recognized that the Persians might still be a danger, and that next time, victory for the Athenians might not prove so easy.
So, 10 years later, in 480, the Persians will return again, led by Xerxes. Remember, X's are pronounced like Z's. It is here that Xerxes will take his army on an inland route. Xerxes believed that by going inland, his forces could be spread out. At Salamis, the Spartan leader Leonidas and 300 of his brave soldiers will buy time. The idea was that Xerxes' navy would be destroyed by the Athenian navy, and with the Persian navy destroyed, Xerxes and his men would have to retreat. Let's hear more about the Battle of Salamis.
The Persian Empire had already launched its invasion of the Greek territory. Without finding much resistance, they kept subduing the Greek city-states along the way. But the route towards the domination of Greece would not be as easy as the Persians had forecasted. Many Greek cities came together to halt the Persian horde's advance. Over land, the Spartans tried to contain them in the gorge of Thermopylae. At sea, the Athenian fleet and its allies would play a decisive role. The Athenians were led by Themistocles, who, for more than 10 years before, had managed to convince the citizens of Athens of the importance of edifying a strong fleet, because he knew that the victory of the Greeks over the Persians at the Battle of Marathon was just the first of several that would follow. His war vessels were known as triremes, since they had 3 tiers of rowers, and they were the very best in terms of war vessels. In an initial stage, the fleet would give coverage to the Spartans who fought on land, hence preventing the Persian navy to disembark their troops in the rear of the Greeks fighting at Thermopylae. However, after the fall of Leonidas and his 300, Themistocles ordered his fleet to return to Athens. After having surpassed the Spartan blockade, the Persian army kept going and conquered city after city until they reached the gates of Athens. The city, for the most part, had been almost completely evacuated, aware that anyone who opted for staying in the city would be accepting their death sentence. Xerxes invaded the city, pillaging everything that he could, and destroying everything that was left behind. He had fulfilled his father's wish to burn Athens to ashes. But his victory was not yet complete. The Athenian navy had to be defeated as well. The fleet was docked at the Straits of Salamis, near Athens. Themistocles found himself in a difficult situation. The ship ratio was 2 to 1 in favor of the Persians. Even though the Greeks had modern vessels, the Persian fleet was formed by experienced Phoenician and Egyptian sailors. Victory seemed impossible to reach. But Themistocles was already a thorough connoisseur of Persian strategies and realized that they always preferred to avoid direct and difficult clashes. They were always prone to rely on betrayals to streamline their paths. That was the situation in Miletus and Thermopylae, and so Salamis would not be any different. But this time, Themistocles would use a betrayal to his advantage. He sent his reliable servant on a mission to deceive Xerxes. The Greek man pretended to be a traitor and said he had valuable information to the Persians, which he would share in exchange for a reward. The Persians were curious to know what the traitor had to say. He disclosed the place where the Greek fleet was hidden, saying that the troops were disorganized and on the brink of defection. The Persian intelligence, with its clever spies, already knew that the Greek leaders were fighting between themselves, and they glimpsed a repetition of the Battle of Lade, with the Greeks deserted during the fight, granting an easy victory to the Persians. Xerxes decided to send his great fleet for an attack against Greece and end the Greek navy once and for all. The Persian navy had bitten the bait of Themistocles and headed towards the Straits of Salamis. When entering the straits, the Persian vessels were astounded. What should have been a jumbled enemy was actually an opponent established in battle formation and motivated to stand up for their land. Akin to the Battle of Thermopylae, the Straits of Salamis neutralized the numerical advantage of the Persian vessels, as there was not much space to maneuver. The battle started, and the Greeks attacked the Persian vessels with their rams of bronze. Many Persian vessels sunk right away. Those that managed to resist the impact were then approached, and a one-on-one fight would take place on the decks of the ships. The Greek vessels were more maneuverable, and so they started encircling the Persians. Even though the Persians had many ships, they got stuck, and so they started to collide and cause damage onto their own allies. Xerxes watched everything from a throne placed atop of the hill. He could not believe what was happening. The Persian war vessels were being sunk one by one. Thousands of soldiers were drowning or struggled for their lives amid the ships. The Persian men who could swim up to the beach were as unlucky as those who drowned, because, on the shores, Greek hoplites were ready to kill those who made it to the beach. The Persian defeat became evident after they lost 1/3 of their fleet, and so the admiral ordered a retreat. The Greek victory was decisive. Now Themistocles and his ships ruled the seas of Greece. Winter was coming. War would have to wait. Xerxes decided that the ruined city of Athens was no place for the king of the world, and so he decided to return to Asia. Nonetheless, a considerable part of his gigantic army stayed under the command of General Mardonius, having the mission to dominate the rest of Greece.
With Athens in ashes, the new buildings that would be constructed after this great victory at Salamis would usher Athens into the golden age, a time when we will hear about great poets, great architects, great leaders, and great writers. And that's where we'll start on Monday.